Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thanks for finding me in the crowded world of YouTube orchid videos. My channel is about me trying to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without any help from greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers or any equipment. Really just me and them struggling along either inside or outside or not at all. So if those sound like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. Hit the notification bell so you'll know exactly when my orchidy missives land in the ether, and we'll see what unfolds. And what is unfolding today, plant lovers of the world, is, yes, it is Australian Dendrobium time. And look at all of these. Let me just say the room is filled with fragrance because one of the things that these orchids generally have in common is fragrance. And it is early spring and they are all doing their thing. So I thought it's time for an Australian Dendrobium epic. Now I've been filming various ones of mine as they've come out. So I've got little bits of footage over the last sort of couple of months to slot in and show you. And then we're just going to cover basic care really. Some of the mistakes that I've made, which I've got some examples to show you. Some repotting issues and also the issue of keikis. So there's quite a lot to get through. Now I've made lots of videos about Australian Dendrobiums and I've got a playlist, so I'll link that below. And then throughout the video, I'll link other things that are appropriate, but all of those things you'll find in that playlist. I have made shorts about Australian Dendrobiums as well. There's a lot there. And I know a lot of people outside of Australia try to grow Australian Dendrobiums and they're a little hard to find in some other parts of the world. So if you've managed to get one, you really want to do your best to look after it. I am no expert, but I've managed to keep a few alive and to bloom. So maybe some basics will help you navigate that path for keeping them alive for you, as you've gone to all the trouble to find one and want it to thrive. So Australia has a lot of native dendrobiums and some are more famous than others, but the Dendrobium genus spreads all the way from the Himalayas in Asia all the way through Asia, through that peninsula with Vietnam, Malaysia, across into Indonesia, into Australia and across into the Pacific Islands. So that's a big spread, which also means a lot of very different types of plants and geographies and climate and conditions. And the Australian ones are referred to as hard cane dendrobiums, and generally they are not deciduous. So unlike, say, the Himalayan dendrobiums, which can lose their leaves, these ones won't unless the cane is dying. A natural death, which comes to us all. But you know what? I'm going to drop in footage now of Orchid Society Council of Victoria's Orchid Spectacular that was a few weeks ago now, but there was the most incredible array of Australian dendrobiums, from hybrids to species. They were all in bloom and it was the most glorious sight to behold. The flowers were incredible, the fragrance was beautiful. A lot of smaller growers and a lot of small growers, unfortunately, that are actually winding down their business. So part of my concern, plant lovers, is to try and get as many of these plants as I can before they're really hard to find here. So probably in cultivation, there are sort of three most famous species, I think, and then hybrids derived thereof. So Dendrobium speciosum, which is the amazing, commonly known as Sydney rock orchid, very chunky canes, amazing sprays of flowers. You can see the image here. Then the other most popular one, or most famous one perhaps, is Dendrobium kingianum, which are some of these that we've got here. Smaller plant, smaller canes, smaller flowers, very fragrant, very beautiful. And then perhaps the other third most commonly found one is called Dendrobium delicatum. And the canes are long and elegant, the flowers, spikes are long and elegant, and the flowers are elegant, usually sort of a pale, very pale lilac, but incredibly fragrant. Now, I made a video a few weeks ago about rescuing a Dendrobium kingianum of a friend of mine, and I did quite a bit of research into Dendrobium kingianum, and this book, which is new, well, new to me, it was actually first published in 1985, it might still be around. It's a series of books about all the orchids of the world, basically, and this volume is about Australian orchids, by J.N. Rentoul, Growing Orchids, Book 4, The Australasian Families. You might be able to find this online or in junk shops. I actually found it in a second-hand bookshop in Hobart in Tasmania, all 4 volumes. I was thrilled. So this was very interesting about Dendrobium kingianum and just how variable it is. So you can get small ones and you can get tall ones and you can get all manner of different colors. So it's a very variable species, which means you can get a huge variety of hybrids derived thereof. But you know what? Without further ado then, we've got those three kind of key ones. Let's look at each one. So firstly, let's go back to a few weeks ago when I made this little video about my Dendrobium speciosum, which is just too large for me to move. Let's have a look. Well, plant lovers, here is my fantastic Dendrobium speciosum. Now, it's got 4 spikes this year. 2 are visible here, there's 2 over there. It's in such a tricky spot, I can't actually get it out, so we can't see it all. But look, classic golden yellow flowers with a slight sort of ivory centre to them, vague fragrance. And then just behind here, I've got a hybrid, which is a slightly smaller flower and a whiter tone. So they're getting as much direct sunlight as I'm able to give them. They do get a bit of protection from some silver birch trees just above them. And when I move, of course, I'll have to find another good nook for them. But they're living life to the fullest here. I do allow them to dry out quite a bit. As you can see, they're sort of open to the elements. And I made a video about the ones that I saw at the Sydney Botanic Gardens, which were growing at ground level, but in nooks of rocks that had been created to sort of create like a rock garden for the Sydney rock orchid, which is its common name. So they do tend to go in cycles of blooming. So you have a great season and then a not so great season. This, I think, is in between. So last year I had nothing. The year before it was a mass of spikes, and this year 4, which is not bad. Now they can continue to spike from the same cane over and over, year on, until that cane sort of loses the will to live and drops its leaves. Even then though, it can still bloom. So don't be tempted to trim any dead canes until they're really desiccated and shriveled and beige, and you know they have really given up the will to live. Otherwise, it's a sensational orchid, and if you can get a couple of them, slightly different colours, they do look amazing. I went to the Ozkov Orchid Spectacular a few weeks ago, made a video which I'll link, and there was just seas of these in bloom, and it was a miraculous sight to behold, and certainly was starting to trigger my desire to own more. But never mind, I think 2 is enough, and I have got a rescue one that I repotted, didn't bloom this year, maybe next year it will, so that might be enough. Anyway, that's Dendrobium speciosum and a hybrid thereof doing its thing this spring. Isn't it fabulous? They are the most glorious of plants. Now, the Australian Dendrobiums are generally epiphytes or lithophytes, or sometimes they can be a bit of both. They can be quite opportunistic. And the Dendrobium speciosum's common name is Sydney rock orchid. And in fact, I took this video in the Sydney Botanic Gardens. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I happened to be there in the week that their collection was all in bloom, and I've never been there at the exact right time. I've seen the plants, I've seen them in spike, but I've never seen them in bloom, and it was a glorious sight to behold. Look at that field of gold. And as you can see, they have been planted in the crevices of rocks. Now, that's a contrived garden. It's been built so those rocks are placed there and the orchids planted there, but it does give you an idea of the type of conditions that plant will thrive in. But it can also grow very happily epiphytically in the fork of trees. Well, plant lovers, little handheld magic. Look at this amazing Dendrobium speciosum that's growing in that old tree trunk. The most incredible root system, and look at the size of those canes. Just the most amazing thing. You can see around the back it's fully occupying this old stump, which will be slowly decomposing, and the orchid will be getting lots of great nutrition from all the organic matter in there. But it's totally filled that space. What a great way to use an old tree trunk if you happen to have one. The flowers are much sort of whiter, so it will be some form. There isn't a name, it's just saying Dendrobium speciosum, but nonetheless, great to see. And interesting just how much shade it's getting. It's under the shade of some eucalypts and acacia trees. So generally a bright light plant, and it is not covered in spikes, as you can see. I mean, it looks pretty good nonetheless, but I think maybe if it got more sun, it might be a bit more floriferous. But isn't it great to see something almost as you would find it in nature? So Dendrobium speciosum really likes good light. Now, if it gets direct sun for a lot of the day, the leaves are going to get burnt terribly, but it will still bloom like there's no tomorrow. It does love bright light. So the best compromise for horticulture to keep it looking great is morning to sort of midday light, and then dappled light in the afternoon to protect it from fierce sun if you're in a climate like Australia where the afternoon sun can be vicious. All of these orchids too are really prone to periods of drought in the wild. So Australia has quite erratic rain systems. So it can be very wet and then it can be quite dry for a period of time. And in fact, today, plant lovers, it is very wet, miserable and cold, and it's early spring. So that is a key consideration in your care. But you know what? We might get to care more fully in a minute. Now I've made a video about my speciosum and I will link that. And I made a video about 4 months ago about rescuing a speciosum, and I'm going to just show it to you now. Oh, actually, I didn't really rescue it. I repotted it. So there's the plant. So one of the things you can see about speciosum, look at the thickness of those canes. They are really, really massive compared to the other types. So the kingianum and delicatum. Look at that, massive. What you might be able to see is lots of juicy new roots growing in here. So this is a good case in point. Now, as you can see, my other speciosum is in bloom. This one, look, conspicuously absent are the flowers. Now, the reason for that, well, who knows what the reason is, but speciosums do particularly go through periods, cycles of flowering. So the first year I had mine, it bloomed incredibly from every cane, and each cane can produce sometimes 2, sometimes 3 spikes. So it can be just this cascade of gold. Last year, nothing. And this year, 4 spikes. So it's kind of halfway in between. So it's certainly, like many things, like fruit trees, they go through that period of having a bumper year and a less bumper year and a medium year and a bad year. So that one I repotted in midwinter. And in terms of potting them, honestly, these are tough orchids. So if you've got to repot it, you can kind of repot it at any point, even when it's in flower, because they're really, really tough. But generally the best time to repot them would be in late spring after it's bloomed and as the new growths are starting to emerge. Now, just looking at that plant, let me get it again to show you. You can see the size of it. It's quite substantial, and speciosum is a really, really big plant. Now, they also take a long time to mature. So a plant is not going to be at flowering size until it's at least 10 years old, and sometimes even later than that from a seedling. So that does bring us to the evil face of capitalism, plant lovers, because if you want one and you want it to bloom, you've got to make that decision. Now, the seedlings are obviously much cheaper. Mature plants are a lot more expensive. Now, at the Ozkov Orchid Spectacular, beautiful mature flowering plants were multiple hundreds of dollars, sometimes from sort of 150 to 250, even more, depending on the variety and the form. So it's really expensive. It's a lot of money to spend on a plant. However, you could spend $15, $20, $25, $30 on a seedling and then have to wait 10 years. So, as they say in fashion, cost per wear. Ultimately, you have to decide if you can afford it and you really want a flowering specimen, try and find one. Now, plant lovers, this is when you have to get tricky. Depends where you are in the world, but here in Australia, obviously we have a better supply of these plants, so it is a bit easier. I found that plant that I just showed you at a lovely nursery that I go to often, but something had happened to it. I don't know if someone had dropped it or whatever had happened to it, but there were no flowers on it, and half the plant had been quite damaged. The leaves were damaged, and it was half price. So I can't really remember what I paid for it, but it was something like $45-ish. It really wasn't expensive. Now, if that was in bloom, it would have been at least $150. Now, the speciosum of mine that's outside and blooming that I just showed you, I bought that from Facebook Marketplace for $50, which was the buy of the century. Now, the lady I bought it from knew what it was, but she didn't know the name of it, and she would have some idea. It also wasn't in bloom when I bought it. Obviously, anything in flower is going to be a premium price. So try all those methods. Try orchid groups, try online selling platforms, try any of those network selling platforms. Try going to places that sell things in bloom when the flowers are dead, because no one often will buy a plant with dead flowers except you, plant lovers, and me, because it's a lot cheaper. So speciosum is kind of in a category of its own in terms of the amount of time it takes to get it to flower and how expensive it is. But what a plant when it's in flower. Okay, let's look at this very wonky footage now of Dendrobium delicatum. This is a plant of mine I've had for a long time. In fact, it's one of the first orchids I ever bought. I bought it at a flea market here in Melbourne where you can buy orchids, and I go deliberately to hunt them down. It's a reliable bloomer for me. It flowers from every cane and often multiply from each cane. The flowers are almost white, but sort of a very, very pale lilac with the most beautiful fragrance. Now, all of these plants will be fine bringing them indoors when they're in bloom because the fragrance does fill the air. It's a very light, gorgeous fragrance. And if you love fragrant orchids, then this is certainly a group of plants to explore. Now, that delicatum plant for me, I haven't repotted that for 5-6 years. When I first potted it, it's still in the same mix. We'll get to that in a minute. So it's a naturally occurring hybrid. It's not that easy to perhaps find it named correctly, but you'll certainly see it. The long canes, those long sprays of flowers. It does look quite different to, certainly from speciosum, but also from all these other hybrids that you see out there. So a very beautiful addition to your Australian Dendrobium collection, if you can find one. And then the other most common one is this, Dendrobium kingianum. Now, in the video I made a few weeks ago about rescuing a friend of mine's giant plant, we talked about the variability of kingianum. So you can get plants like this, which I think is quite typical, quite thin canes, quite long straggly spikes, and not that many flowers on the actual spike itself. So I would say this is, I mean, true to type, as the books say. It's such a variable species, but this is very much your run-of-the-mill kingianum, very, very pale pink, smallish flower, quite long, elegant canes. But this is also a Dendrobium kingianum, and this is a variety called Jazzy. But you can see basically the flowers are the same, just a very deep magenta, but it's got that much more squat habit. Now, one of the things that Dendrobium kingianum can do is create keikis vigorously, but we'll get to that, which fall, and it can create a mat of plants. And it can exist on almost no water and in no medium. It's such a tough plant. So depending really, I guess, on the environment it found itself, you can find them quite stubby, sort of dwarf plants like this, quite short canes, multiple keikis because it wants to just reproduce itself and form a tangled mat. Or you'll find something like this. Look at the comparison between those two. So this one with those long elegant canes and long elegant flower spikes is also considered the same. So a lot of variability in the Dendrobium kingianum world. But it means though, as a grower or a collector, there are just endless opportunities and forms. Now this one has got 2 spikes, this one is yet to open. I bought this one because it's such a beautiful deep magenta, such a gorgeous flower. Look at that, let me get myself out of the way and you can see the flower. Isn't it beautiful? Now there is an albino version of this too, which I made a film about, which I will link. Again, same habit, quite short canes and wants to really form a mat. A beautiful, beautiful orchid. Okay, so those are probably the 3 most common species, speciosum, delicatum, kingianum. Now let's just step back in time to a few of mine that have been flowering over the last month. Let's have a look at those. Well, plant lovers, the first of my Aussie hybrid dendrobiums to flower, actually it's literally just winter, is this Dendrobium Jesmond sparkler gracilicaule. Such a beautiful flower. Now quite a complex hybrid. So in this baby, there is a little bit of Dendrobium speciosum, Dendrobium kingianum, Dendrobium falcarostrum, and Dendrobium tetragonum. So quite a mixed ancestry there, but what an incredible flower. Isn't it just stunning? The color is amazing. Let me just try and make sure. There we go, there we go. It's kind of gold almost with pinky red around the edges and in the middle of the lip there. Just the most beautiful flower. Absolutely stunning. Now, as you can see, that's its habit, not particularly big. This was a seedling, and you can see in there, I think, kind of how big it was, small canes with a couple of leaves. So it's done reasonably well. I'm surprised it's flowered actually, because I have a feeling with some of that speciosum blood, it might just need a few more years to bulk up. Anyway, but there we go. It's flowered for me. Now, when it's bigger, these plants really should bloom from just about every cane. Should be very floriferous. But it does need, as they all do, plenty of sunlight, particularly with this one obviously in autumn, heading into winter, to stimulate the flowers. Again, pretty tough. I mean, you can forget to water any of these Aussie Dendrobium hybrids, I think, for a bit and they'll survive. They won't love you for it, but they won't die. They can take really strong sun, but the leaves, which this one isn't, will get a bit sunburnt, but best bet is to try and give it bright direct light in the morning and then dappled indirect light in the afternoon if your sun is very harsh, if you're growing it outside. But if your climate is too cold in winter, it will just need to be somewhere with as much bright direct light as it can get during those winter months. And then if it's warm enough, you can certainly take it outside in summer. Anyway, there we are. Jesmond sparkler gracilicaule, an absolutely sensational hybrid. And I really hope that this bulks up,
gets more floriferous and that I get a flower spike from every cane in the coming seasons, because that is a glory to behold. Well, plant lovers, here we are. It is now first days of spring, and I just wanted to show you this fantastic Dendrobium, Australian hybrid, that is out in bloom. Now, I bought this a couple of weeks ago at the Oscov Orchid Spectacular, and I'll drop in the links to the 2 videos I made there. And that fair, I have to say, is the most wonderful opportunity to see flowering plants in flower. What am I saying? Anyway, plants in flower, where you can actually tell what the color is and what the form is, so you can make your considered choice. And this one leapt out at me. There were so many flowering Australian Dendrobium hybrids there and species that it's kind of, where do you begin, literally? But I've got a lot, so I was just looking for something that was a little different. And this really leapt out at me. Firstly, the size of the flowers. Each one is really big. And if we compare it to the size of the sort of kingianum species type, there you go, you can see just how tiny those flowers are. So this will be a hybrid of a few species, I imagine, and kingianum will most certainly be part of that ancestry. But it's not a named variety, so I can't tell you exactly what it was. But I just love the golden yellow heart of the flower, which then comes out in these sort of burgundy degradé streaks to basically a deep burgundy tip. It's the most beautiful flower. Not that fragrant. The kingianum, the species types tend to be a little bit more fragrant, but this one is absolutely stunning. So there we are, plant lovers, part of the journey of my flowering Australian Dendrobium types, and this one is certainly giving bang for buck. The best time to apply fertilizers is at the growth stage, which may be any time following flowering, and like many of the Australian catalogues of Dendrobiums, there is a need for constant air movement, preferably fresh. Okay, so let's add my fertilizing regime. So as per the book, really, in spring, I give a topical application of a slow release generic fertilizer. You could use one that's orchid specific. And then throughout the warmer season, the growing season, I do occasionally give a liquid fertilizer that can be, again, orchid specific or more of a tonic like a seaweed based solution. And I always dial it down to sort of 1/8, 1/10 of the recommended dose on the bottle. And that's kind of it. They sort of have to fend for themselves. Well, it is literally the last days of winter, and the Australian Dendrobium check-in. I'm doing rolling videos as each sort of different one comes out. And this one is just stunning. It's the most beautiful sort of pale, I guess, lilac with quite spotted lip. It's absolutely stunning. And I've got, what have I got? Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spikes. A couple of them haven't actually opened yet, but what a stunning plant. Now, I bought this one this time last year at the Oscov, the Orchid Society's Council of Victoria's spectacular last year in 2023. Now, I've just made a video about this year's 2024, which was a few weeks ago. I'll link below. And one of the sellers that I mentioned was a place called Orchids on Newbold, and this is where I got this one from. So they also have a lot of Australian Dendrobiums and Australian native orchids. And what a glorious plant. Again, for me now, it's just really about the color and the form. And this is a cross between Dendrobium amberbanks Albury and, wow, Ceinwein. Not quite sure how one would pronounce that, but you can be the judge. Got that classic form, which looks more sort of kingianum and delicatum in terms of the fineness of the canes and the, I guess, the elegance of the plant, let's just say. And the flowers, the way that the spikes are sort of quite long and the flowers tend to cluster at the top. But what a beauty, and look at those divine flowers. Now you can see perhaps from the color of the spikes. So I had, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 new growths. And these are the ones that are still much more sort of silvery with the sheaths, whereas the older growths, as you can see, have matured somewhat. But it did put on a massive amount of growth for me. Actually, it could have just been these 2. I'm getting carried away. These 2 this year. So the newest canes haven't flowered. They do often take a year to mature before they'll bloom. And then the older canes have all produced the flowers. And as with most of these types, the flowers can come from the apex of the cane for the first time. And then really at any point, down to the first couple of centimetres, the first few inches of the cane. Depending on how old the cane is, the flowers will emerge. And the canes can keep on flowering, so do not cut them. You can see here some of the very juvenile ones, which are quite, well, naked and a little shriveled, but they're not dead, so wouldn't be trimming those off until they are really desiccated and brown beige, when you know there's no life in them to give anymore. Isn't it beautiful? And I love the bobbing habit of these. And the great thing is too that if you get a couple of different hybrids, they're all going to open at slightly different times. So you will extend the flowering period of your Australian Dendrobium types. So that's that little baby. But the other gift that keeps on giving, plant lovers, is this one here. Oh, and it's quite a heavy beast. Let me just rearrange our mise en scene for you. Ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. And there we are. Look at that one. Now, I've mentioned this many a time before. Look at those flowers. Look at the size of them. And look at the colour. Just sensational. Now, this is a hybrid that a viewer told me has actually been named, and it's now called Dendrobium Gippsland. And it's a cross between Colonial Campio and Speciosum, Dendrobium Speciosum Windermere, which is one of the more famous forms of flower of Dendrobium speciosum, quite famous for its vigor and beauty. And in its ancestry, there is a particular species that can flower periodically at any point. So I've made a video about this one, but the point being, it's still in bloom. So it's kind of ongoing. Now, here is a spike that is finished flowering. So I'm going to trim you off, just cut it right back down as far as you can to the cane. Ta-da, ta-da. There's another one that needs to come off here, which we just trim off. And that one, oh, it's still got two flowers hanging on, we'll leave it. So I've just trimmed off the dead canes, and really just this last spike is now in full bloom. But isn't it beautiful? So I don't know, this has been months worth of blooming for me. And then I'm imagining we're going to have a bit of a rest period. I might even get more spikes though in spring. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Interesting plant. It's a little bit scabby, as you can see. The older canes are very naked and yellowed. And I don't think I have had, or have I? No. So there's been no new growth since I've owned it. Now I did repot it. I would have expected a bit of new growth, to be honest. Most things do, when you refresh the medium, go hurrah, and they'll send up a ton of new growths, as this one did here. So I think I got at least two fantastic massive new canes. And of course the great thing is that with this type of orchid, the more canes you have, the more flowers you're going to get. So I was a little, not disappointed, but noted the fact that this one chose not to send up any new growths. Or am I lying? Is that a new growth there? Do you know, I now can't remember. So this one hasn't flowered, and the leaves aren't affected by the sun and whatever's been going on with these in the past. So actually, maybe I did go to new growth. So maybe I just lied. Just forget everything I just said. The point being though, with this one is that it blooms multiply throughout the year, which is not that common with the Australian Dendrobium type. So if you can add one of those to your collection, you have extended your flower time exponentially. Anyway, plant lovers, from these two, let's wait and see what's going to be open in the next few weeks as we continue on with this Australian Dendrobium epic. So as you can see, although the flowers themselves aren't that long lasting, if you get a couple of different plants, the odds are you're going to get flowers for a month, 6 weeks, because they're just going to flower at slightly different periods. Now, this was another plant that I mentioned in a previous Dendrobium video, and this was, I presumed, a Dendrobium kingianum, but it came from a friend's house, and she bought a very old property that was built in the 1870s, which is very old in Australia, and there was lots of this orchid hanging around, and I just assumed it was a kingianum type because of the way that it was growing, but it never flowered for her. So she gave me some cakeys, and Dendrobium kingianum will cakey like there's no tomorrow, but she never flowered it. So I was sort of intrigued to find mine flowering for the first time. Now, it's still just getting its groove on, I think. But anyway, as you can see, it is not the most earth-shattering of flower. It is very, very typical of that kingianum type. So sort of a pale pinkish, bit of streaking, quite a lovely lip though, I must say, on that one. But just the form of the plant is quite different. So you see you've got these long canes,
quite fine, but it's a much shorter version. So it looks very different in form to that one, which has got quite short fat canes, as you can see, quite different. So this form is very much like this form, but just to a smaller degree. Interesting. So I'll certainly keep it because just the habit is slightly different. So I'm also just happy to be able to show my friend what hers is going to look like should it ever bloom back up the mountain. Okay, let's talk care, shall we? So firstly, Dendrobium kingianum. Now that orchid, which is this one here, is notorious for producing keikis. And in fact, I think if we have a look at this one, there are, yes, look, there are keikis right there. And you can just snap them off. Ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. So generally, when a plant's producing keikis, it's trying to survive, so it's not that happy. So the conditions aren't usually optimum. However, Dendrobium kingianum is a species that is very, very prone to produce keikis. So it's got nothing to do with the relative care and conditions you're giving it. It doesn't mean it's wrong or bad or inappropriate. That's just what the plant wants to do. So I didn't realize that until quite recently, and I was always concerned thinking I'm doing something very, very wrong. But no, it's sort of the natural desire of the plant. And with hybrids, the more kingianum that's in them, the more you're probably going to get keikis. Now, speciosum, I have never had any of my plants produce a keiki whatsoever. So sure, perhaps they can in the right circumstance, but the kingianum types and hybrids derived thereof, certainly more prone to do that. Now my delicatum as well has a lot of, I think, kingianum DNA coursing through its veins. That produces a ton of keikis as well. And I've got a few to show you because it's quite interesting in terms of just how tough they are. Now, this one here, that has almost got no roots whatsoever that I just pulled off. It's just got a few little green nibs at the base there. I would still shove that in a pot. Now, this is the sort of pot that I put them in, and I use out of the bag orchid mix. Now, that is an orchid mix that I would use for cymbidiums. It would also be the base I would use for aroids as well. If you grow anthuriums, for example, I would use that with a bit of perlite. So it's it's got bark in it, but it's a bit grittier, so it's a bit more sort of composty, but still very light and free draining. So I use that out of the bag mix for all of my Australian Dendrobiums. If you are somewhere else in the world and your packaged orchid mix is slightly different, you can just grow them in medium-sized bark. But the grower that I met at the Orchid Spectacular in the video grows hers in a very particular medium to make it lighter. So it really depends where you are. It doesn't really matter. But what you can see here is, so there is the original keiki, and it had no roots. So I put that little cane and a little wire to keep it upright. And it's very quickly shot up with new growth. So you can see, look at those lovely green leaves there. Very, very vigorous. So literally all you do is snap off those keikis, shove them in a pot with a little orchid mix. Off you go. Within a year, you'll have a plant and it will be flowering. Exhibit B. So here's some more Dendrobium delicatum keikis I just put in this pot. And you can see it has just started to produce one flower from that keiki, which is also producing a keiki. Now, the other thing you can perhaps see in there, and I might come in and show you more closely, is that little brown spike is a new spike emerging. So it's early spring and it's starting to grow. Now, very quickly, that's going to fill this pot. This one is already starting to distend the pot that it's in, so quite vigorous. These are the same. I'm actually growing these two on because I want to gorilla plant them in trees outside our new house. So no one will be able to reach them. I'll have to put the plants up there with a ladder, but there's a few nooks, they're mature trees. So I'm going to put a little bit of bark up there, shove these in and just let them go for it. And then every spring, people will walk by and go, oh my goodness, what is that amazing cloud of flowers and that delicious fragrance? So that's keikis and potting. Whatever you pot them in, just make it loosish and free draining. So imagine those plants, those lithophytic, epiphytic plants. They will be collecting their own matter in that tangled web of tangled mass of roots and canes they produce. So there'll be a little bit of leaves broken down, a bit of bark, a bit of bird poo every now and then. So very, very free draining, and the water will pass through and then it will dry and evaporate, and the plant might not get water for days or weeks, and then the cycle returns again. So with watering, if you're growing them in a pot and you're somewhere where you have to grow them indoors all year, tough love is the way to go, I think. So make sure your medium is free draining, and then make sure that you allow them to dry out. So I wouldn't have a regular watering pattern. I would try and replicate the wild if you can. Obviously in summer, water them more. In winter, water them less. But try and let them really dry out, at least sort of once every 3 or 4 waterings, really dry out, and then really drench them again. So I think that sort of tough love philosophy is going to really help you if you're growing them indoors all year, all the time. Now I'm lucky that I can grow mine outdoors all year, all the time, and some of mine are undercover and I have to water them, and some of mine are exposed to the elements and I just leave them to it really. But they are all under trees. Now, light is the most important thing. So these orchids need really good, strong, and sometimes direct light to bloom. Morning light is fantastic, midday light, fantastic. As I said with speciosum, as you get towards the middle of the afternoon, the leaves can get really burnt by that hot sun. They'll still flower amazingly probably for you, but the leaves won't look great. So maybe dappled light from the afternoon onwards. If you're growing them inside, try and put them in perhaps an east-facing window where they're going to get really strong bright light in the morning, and then maybe dappled light as the sun moves around. And depending on the species, some of them are quite high altitude and they can actually take quite cold temperatures. One of my viewers grows kingianum in Japan and his go down to -8 degrees centigrade. Here we rarely get to 0 centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit, very, very rarely. The lowest probably in Melbourne, where I am in the inner city, would be maybe 2 to 3 degrees on a really cold night in winter. But these are really tough orchids, so they can take that, as long as there's plenty of light, and then you're going to get that summer warmth. So I think the biggest hurdle for the indoor grower of these, if you're anywhere else in the world, would be getting the watering right, not overdoing it, and getting the light right so that you're stimulating the canes to flower. Now I think we've gone through most of these in previous videos, but this one I just want to show you again, if I can untangle it. There we are. Such a fine little flower, look at that. And this one is a type of Dendrobium gracilicaule, which is not that common species, slightly hard to find, but very, very fine sprays of flowers, and they're almost sort of like a very pale lemon. So this is a beauty. Now, you can see lots of canes there and only 2 spikes. The problem with me at the moment, plant lovers, is that where I am, I can't really give all of my plants the really best light that they need to bloom. So I'm hoping once we move and I can solidify where they all are, they're going to get much better light, because really you should be getting blooms from every cane. And this one is a plant that I bought last year at the Melbourne Orchid Spectacular, and look at that, isn't it just beautiful? So again, it's that beautiful magenta, but with a very, very strong white interior to the flower. So this is a cross between a Dendrobium kingianum, and it's a bit of a complex hybrid kingianum to start with, and then speciosum Windermere, and a hybrid thereof of that. So there's quite a bit of complexity in its ancestry, but you can see the canes are a little fatter than its kingianum friends, really heading towards that speciosum territory, and the flowers are a little larger and the spikes more pronounced. So yeah, it's got a bit more of that speciosum characteristic. So as well as getting the light and water right, you kind of need to give them plenty of air movement too. So imagine they're growing out in the wilds, they're on those sort of rocky nooks or in the forks of trees, they're going to get lots of air movement. Now, this kingianum I had in the perfect spot, but it then got sort of grown out by things that were just too vigorous. So it got too shady, and it was in a very still environment because of that. So no breeze was really penetrating and not much light. So I fished it out, gave it better light, and it's bloomed for me. But what you can see is that the leaves were very, very affected by fungus because they were just in the wrong place. So they were in too still and too dark a condition. So those are the touched leaves, and then these are the new leaves. See how green and beautiful they are. So you do need to try and replicate that very breezy, free air movement kind of space if you can. Otherwise, you are going to get issues with leaves, and also the plant won't flower. Now, this was another one that I had actually in the same place as that kingianum, and you can see quite stunted, although I feel that this is kind of halfway in terms of growth points between that really short form of kingianum and the really long form. But it did bloom for me once I moved it, and they're very, very pretty flowers, much paler with a spotted lip, really, really delicious. But this plant really could do with a repot, and the label cunningly just says Dendrobium kingianum, but you can see it's quite a different flower. But there's a lot of dead canes in here and a lot of detritus, so I probably in a few weeks, when it's not raining cold and miserable, just pull this out and clean it up. And what we can just see there, so those are the dead canes. So you can see they're very shriveled, very sort of beigey golden brown. That's when the cane has got nothing left to give, and you can certainly trim those off. Now, although it's not deciduous, you can see, let me look at this other one, this group of orchids can drop its leaves as the canes age. So let me get rid of that tag for you. So you can see these canes here have lost their leaves. So they're on the way out, nothing much to give, but a cane that is still vigorous and doing its thing will have leaves at the top. So I would just wait until those canes have completely desiccated and turned that sort of orangey beigey brown, and then you could trim them off, and they might even just pull off quite easily. Or you can unpot the plant and trim off those dead canes. If it hasn't shriveled, do leave it, because they can still bloom even from a leafless cane. And in fact, that one is an old flower spike from a leafless cane. So there we are, plant lovers. I think this is an epic that we've covered just about everything. Do leave any questions below. As I said, I'm certainly not an expert in this type of orchids, but I have a lot, and most of them do reasonably well. And I've made pretty classic mistakes, I think, in terms of setting a plant back, which we've gone through. So, you know, I've got reasonable experience with them. The key things are getting the water right and getting the light right, and you should have no trouble. So, all of you out there outside of Australia, good luck with your Australian Dendrobiums. They are at their peak now, and it's just glorious. The fragrance is delicious. I mean, some forms are more fragrant than others, but if you get a few together, the scent is just delicious. So thank you for watching this Dendrobium epic, plant lovers. And if you want to know what we're doing next week, which might not be quite such an epic, hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. My ramblings are just that, as you've witnessed today, but hopefully they're of interest to you. And I look forward to seeing you next week with whatever orchid adventures we have. Until then, take care. See you next time.